Good afternoon. In the last few moments, over the last hour, you've seen our International Relations Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, talking about several of the issues underway at the moment. Of course, at the moment, we've been playing an important role in BRICS. We hosted the BRICS summit last year. Some changes to BRICS now as Russia takes over the chairmanship of it. Gustavo de Carvalho is a senior researcher at the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Gustavo, good afternoon to you. So BRICS we've seen on the international stage becoming more and more important. Russia now the chair. I wonder how the US sees that. It must be symbolic in some way.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. And I think it showcases a geopolitical dimension that BRICS is increasingly taking, that it's not just about how global South countries and developing economies interact with one another, but also a reflection in terms of how this global divide is actually occurring. I think in terms of the international community, I think in terms of expectations of what we can see BRICS doing this year, I think with Russia, the realm of the group, we should see stronger attempts, at least from the Russian side, to increase the common positions of BRICS members in terms of international crisis, but also I think the expectations in terms of what will happen now in terms of internal dynamics within the group with the 5 new countries joining, but also very important discussions that will be happening this year regarding the increase of trade amongst BRICS members of local currencies, systems of payments, and even digital currencies at this stage.
You say 5 countries. I mean, Argentina was invited, and it flew under the radar, actually. I hadn't even noticed. If I understood correctly, their new president, who came in over the Christmas periods, decided that Argentina won't join. So, I mean, I don't know how BRICS countries see that. Is it possible that something like that could ever happen again?
Well, I think on the Argentinian case, there was already some expectations when Argentina was invited, depending on what would happen in the elections. We saw President Milei in Argentina running with a very anti-BRICS, anti-China, and to a large extent anti-Brazil platform. And so to such an extent, there was not much surprises in that. I think the big surprise at the moment, the representatives of the different BRICS members are currently meeting in Moscow, and we haven't seen Saudi Arabia joining yet. And we saw some statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia a couple of weeks ago saying that there is still a longer process domestically to be done in terms of confirming them. So I think there is still some question marks in terms of how the expansion would actually occur on the ground. But we have seen the other members, Ethiopia, Egypt, Iran, and United Arab Emirates already joining the BRICS meeting that is currently occurring in Russia.
Gustavo, I'm no expert on Saudi Arabian politics, but it's not like there are a lot of people to consult. I mean, aren't all the big decisions really taken by 1 or 2 people and sort of 1 or 2 families? One family, really.
Well, I would say there is a bigger consultation that Saudi Arabia would have to have with some of its international partners. As we know, Saudi Arabia is traditionally and historically an important ally of the United States in the Middle East, is increasingly engaging with China as a bilateral partner. And I think some of its own positioning internationally would have to be taken into consideration at the moment. I think would be a loss for BRICS if Saudi Arabia eventually chooses not to join the group. I think there is the expectation, especially with the discussions around currencies and trade, that Saudi Arabia would bring a lot of value in terms of the conversations. So I think it's an important process to follow and see what decisions they will make in Riyadh.
For many people, and I think many South Africans at the moment, the real issue still is what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East. Is BRICS, do you think, are the BRICS countries going to come to a sort of common position on that? And I'm thinking of some of the members of BRICS. We know what our position is. Iran, obviously, may be aligned to our position in some ways. I would imagine Iran would want BRICS to take a very strong position on Gaza. China may not want to get too involved. Do you expect BRICS to have a common position on what's happening in Gaza?
I think it's an important question. We saw late last year when South Africa called for an extraordinary meeting of the BRICS members on the situation in Gaza. It was interesting to see that South Africa was able to get that meeting, not because it would have a communique or a joint position from BRICS members, but rather a summary of the discussions. I think we still see a lot of divides within the group in terms of their own positions in the conflicts. I think countries like India, countries like China tend to have very specific views regarding that. And I think historically we've seen BRICS really shying away from many of those common positions in international crisis. We've seen in the last 2 days in Moscow many of the current members and the part of the expanded BRICS group calling for a stronger role of BRICS in presenting those positions in crises such as Gaza. But I think it's probably unlikely at this stage to expect that BRICS would play such a role, considering that the way that the group works with working with consensus that tends to lead to some of these minimum common denominators may become very hard for BRICS to really, as a unity, to present one position in a way in which to respond to the crisis. So I think we'll still leave for individual members for their own interventions and responses, such as the ones from South Africa. But I find quite unlikely would be quite surprising to see BRICS really taking a stance in such a unity in such a divisive issue such as the one in Gaza at the moment.
I presume the same goes for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There won't really be much conversation about that either.
Probably even less, I would say. If we look into the two crises that we had in the last 10 years, first the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and then with the invasion in 2022, BRICS made some statements regarding the situation, but very generic and very diluted language presented within that. We also saw this morning Foreign Minister Lavrov from Russia quite directly talking about concerns that he has not of countries that have been engaging with the Ukrainian peace formula that has been led by President Zelensky. And that seemed there was quite a direct mentioning to the role that South Africa has been playing, considering that the country has been an active member of those discussions. So I think we could see internally within the group more of those discussions, but not really expecting some type of solution to the crisis in Ukraine that is led by BRICS at this particular stage.
Gustavo, I mean, in a way, it's interesting to look at the phase of development that BRICS is in. And what I mean by that is it started with 5 countries, relatively easy to get sort of consensus among 5 countries. It now wants to expand. It's a bit like the European Union, which started as a sort of coal community back in the 1950s, really. Now, decisions were easy. Decisions now for the European Union are much harder. You could say exactly the same for NATO. Look at the huge arguments they've had about allowing countries like Sweden in, for example. Is BRICS in a similar sort of phase now? It wants to get bigger. It wants to invite more countries. Argentina decides suddenly not to come. At the same time, the bigger it gets, the more powerful it gets, but the more difficult it gets to manage BRICS. Is it an interesting sort of developmental phase?
It is certainly a conundrum for BRICS members at the moment, and especially because unlike the European Union, that it's heavily regulated by treaties and an understanding in terms of decision making, BRICS still remains a fairly informal group in terms of its own decision and its own arrangements. So the presence of this new 4 or 5 new countries, depending on the decision of Saudi Arabia, will create an impact in terms of the themes and areas that will be discussed. I think at this stage, a lot of the new incoming members are still trying to understand how BRICS operates, but also that will push for a lot of readjustment in terms of the types of discussions and ways in which things are done. We've seen, for instance, this year a considerable increase of the number of meetings that BRICS will have over the year. South Africa organized around 200 meetings in 2023, and we already know that Russia is planning to organize around 250 meetings. It's a 25% increase of the number of meetings. And countries like Brazil, for instance, are already bringing to the attention of the other members that the group needs to provide a reflection in terms of the effectiveness of all of those structures, the ability of the different working groups to really achieve results. And I think that should be an important element for both South Africa but also the other BRICS members to ensure that the expansion does provide an added value to the group in terms of its own objectives. And I think for this year, particularly the discussions on currencies and how trade can be done between its members, but also considering very carefully that the expansion is not just a dilution in terms of the opportunities that the group presents for each of its own members.
Gustavo de Carvalho, thank you. Senior Researcher at the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Really appreciate the time.